1995, a fresh protocol was added to it on prohibiting blinding laser weapons. And as we saw in the presentations that have been made, landmines is one of the weapons that continue to take a toll long after the fighting is over. The third principle is the principle of proportionality. The military action that is to be taken, is it proportional to the harm that has been done, or is it excessive? And finally, the last principle is that the means that have to be used have to avoid unnecessary suffering. You know, those of you who are students of military history would remember we used to have something called dum-dum bullets, and how these were banned because they caused unnecessary suffering. Now, all of these fundamental principles have led to certain conventions, like hospitals not being targeted, like child soldiers, women, and so on. But essentially, these principles are the principles that led to what Colonel Mittal referred to when he said that today there is a meeting taking place in Geneva of the CCW, which is basically the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons deemed to be excessively injurious to human beings. This CCW was concluded in 1980, and today it has 5 protocols. When it was concluded in 1980, it had 3 protocols attached to it. One protocol was on prohibiting non-detectable fragments. The idea was that you could not use munition that would leave an injured person with fragments in the body that could not be detected by X-rays. So that would make it a permanent injury. So the first protocol was to prohibit non-detectable fragments. The second protocol was on landmines, booby traps, and improvised explosive devices. The third protocol was on incendiary weapons. We had seen the use of napalm and incendiary weapons, particularly in Vietnam. And so these were the 3 original protocols. Then in 1995, a fresh protocol was added to it on prohibiting blinding laser weapons. And in 2003, there was yet another added to it on explosive remnants of war. I was heading the Indian delegation when the protocol on landmines was actually amended, so the second protocol, and it became the amended Protocol 2. And in the amended Protocol 2, there was a very curious kind of a divide. People were keen, there were countries, and as Colonel Mittal said, he gave you the slide of the mine ban treaty. Now, this is where the public mood, and it's an interesting development that takes place because this is happening now with the Cold War having ended. Soviet Union had broken up in 1991. Germany had unified. Europe was at peace. We didn't know that Ukraine would break that peace, as we all know now. But Europe, for the first time after 1945, seemed to be at peace, and therefore there was a growing movement towards banning landmines completely. Because you saw the picture of Princess Diana, so there was all of this public sentiment that was building up with what had happened in Angola, what had happened in Afghanistan. In 1989, the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, leaving behind, many unexploded ordnances and landmines, the effect of which are still visible today. So what we did as negotiators was, we amended Protocol 2 to do 2 things. One is, at that time, people were using, particularly a lot of Western countries, were using remotely delivered mines. And with remotely delivered mines, it becomes much more difficult to map them precisely, because you don't really know where exactly they fall. You can probably cordon off an area, but you don't have very clear maps. So the rule, that how it was amended was to add something called self-deactivating mechanisms, make it compulsory. The second thing that we did was with landmines, with anti-personnel landmines, was to insist on a minimum of 8 grams of metallic content, because those years plastic mines had become the norm, and plastic mines were impossible to detect. And so that was, but this amendment was not seen as adequate by the rest of the international community. So a whole host of NGOs got together. There was an ICBL international campaign to ban landmines that came into existence. And that is how the Mine Ban Treaty or the Ottawa Convention was concluded. Today, the CCW actually has 127 states parties, whereas the Mine Ban Treaty has 164. But that is the power of an idea that takes root. The same approach was followed many years later by another convention, and this happened in 2008. And this was the Oslo Convention, once again, on cluster munitions, that banned cluster munitions. And even this convention that was concluded in 2008 has 112 states parties. So what I'm trying to say is that you have, once public sentiment gets created, it takes on a different dimension. Incidentally, the CCW, since 2010, has been discussing the notion of killer robots or lethal autonomous weapon systems. To date, they've been unable to even get a definition on it. They keep debating on whether it should be a legally binding treaty, whether it should be a code of conduct, or does international humanitarian law, can it apply to lethal autonomous weapon systems? Because, and what exactly is autonomy? Will that autonomous weapon system, will it have a man in the loop? Will it have a man on the loop? Or will the man be outside the loop? These kind of decisions which have never yet been taken. But so far, this is the international legal framework. But as I mentioned to you, the international legal framework has been taken out of the negotiations that are limited only to countries, but negotiations that have been taking place in a wider framework of NGOs who come together, make use of the platform of the United Nations General Assembly, where even though the US may be objecting or Russia may be objecting to it, because the 164 countries that are parties to the Mine Ban Treaty does not include countries like US, South Korea, North Korea, Russia, including India and Pakistan, I must acknowledge. And the reason is that these are countries where, the US does not, because the US uses landmines in the demilitarized zone on the Korean Peninsula. We don't. India and Pakistan, we have an ongoing adversarial relationship. And we use mines, but we use it in a highly responsible fashion to try and minimize the kind of civilian casualties that we have seen in other countries. I was posted as ambassador to Afghanistan, where I saw some of the devastation caused by landmines firsthand. And I think Colonel Mittal spoke about the Jaipur Foot Organization. I was in Jaipur speaking on, giving a talk, and there is a very dear friend of mine, one of my junior colleagues, who is currently heading this organization. And I went to see their office and get a briefing on what has been happening, because we had invited people from this organization to come and help and hold camps in Afghanistan. They held an enormously successful series of camps all across Afghanistan in 2004, 5, and so on. So far, what he told me was, if I remember right, that about, and mind you, it is completely gratis. It's done free. It's a pure voluntary work which is being done. They get support. They raise resources. They get support from governments. They get partial support from foundations and things like that. They've provided about 700,000 artificial limbs to victims across the world. And in all, they provide artificial limbs, they provide crutches, wheelchairs, hearing aids, undertake surgeries, and in all, something like about 2.5 million people have benefited from the work that they've done. So I think that this is something which is an enormously wonderful humanitarian work that is being done alongside the